All statements and opinions expressed by guests of the Adult in the Room podcast are strictly their own and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or opinions of the host, producers, or advertisers. All interviews are presented in their most complete possible form in the interests of free speech. No statements should be interpreted as financial, legal, or medical advice. Listener and viewer discretion are strongly advised.
It's the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. That's me. It's a special edition of the Adult in the Room podcast. Hi, Victoria Taft. And, for years, I have been a fan of the spy thriller genre, of popular fiction, starting with Tom Clancy back in the day, starring his protagonist, Jack Ryan. The genre gained a larger core of writers and readers, I think, later. And I especially became just besotted with Vince Flynn's novels and loved his Mitch Rapp character. Look at that. I got the shirt. Mitch Rapp lives. I got it all. And then it brought me to Brad Thor, whose character Scott Harvath is just a wonderful character. I really appreciate him. We go from Mitch Rapp, who had no experience in the military, to a SEAL team member for Scott Harvath. Ben Coe's Dewey Andreas is a Delta Force guy. Jack Carr's James Reese, SEAL, right? Yeah. And then Don Bentley. And here's Don Bentley. Now you say to yourself, okay, wow, I've seen his name everywhere on these novels. He's a professional touchstone with probably every one of the authors I just mentioned. But for sure, obviously, Tom Clancy, where he writes, he's on this show. He writes the Jack Ryan novels, and he writes those under the Clancy imprimatur, I guess. And then Don Bentley's own novels with protagonist Matt Drake. His latest novels, Forgotten War, I want to talk a lot about that with him today, which is set in Afghanistan. And now it's two of my worlds colliding in all wonderfulness, and that is that Don Bentley has just recently been named to take up the mantle and write the novels set forth by Vince Flynn and the Mitch Rapp novels. And he's taking over from Kyle Mills, who has done, I was leery, and God, Kyle Mills just kicked ass on those novels. He's amazing. Incredible. He's an incredible author. And now, of course, Don Bentley. And I just want to welcome you to the Adult in the Room podcast, and I'll try not to fangirl out too much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. You were the first interviewer I've ever seen that's had the Mitch Rapp t-shirt, so I know this is going to be fantastic.
Now, this is really weird because Kyle Mills told me via Facebook where to get it. So I moved heaven and earth. I got it. But what the funny thing was the other night I'm in bed. It's 2:00 in the morning and I'm going, well, I guess I'm just going to check and make sure that shirt's on its way. And it wasn't. And I was so bummed because I live in the provinces, wasn't sure what was happening. And I go, I'm really sad because I sent in the little chat box. Who knew? It's all AI. Is anyone really going to read it? And so I go, I'm really sad because I'm talking to Don Bentley, the new author of the Vince Flynn novels, and I wanted to wear that shirt. And I got a hand note, or, real personal email rather, and a hand addressed thing. We're overnighting it to you right now. And I went, that is the correct answer, Cadet Academy. And it was, and we'll put in the show notes where to get one if you're a Mitch Rapp fan, which I am. And I had Vince on my show several times when I was in radio. And anyway, it's pretty cool having you on.
Yeah, likewise. That might be the coolest Mitch Rapp story I've heard yet, because just my name alone, maybe with $3 get you a cup of coffee. But you put me and Vince Flynn and Mitch Rapp, you get a t-shirt overnighted to you.
And all proceeds go to Vince Flynn's high school, where he applied his trade. And he wanted to go into the military, and he couldn't. He had a pre-existing condition, and he couldn't do it. And God bless Mitch Rapp and his character, and God bless Vince Flynn. But you know what? Mitch Rapp is alive. So let me tell people about your bio, which I think will probably blow a few socks off of people who don't know. And this is straight from your website, and I think you're hiding your really wonderfulness under a bushel, but I'll just give you the bones here. And that is that you spent a decade in the Army as an Apache helicopter pilot. And while deployed in Afghanistan, you were awarded the Bronze Star with a V. And following his time in the military, I read here, Don worked as an FBI special agent, focusing on foreign intelligence and counterintelligence, and was a member of the SWAT team with the FBI. And let's see, following your time in the military, you worked in the FBI, and I want to talk about that. And then you went then to work in the private sector, which was basically a defense contractor, working out gadgets and stuff for special operators. I don't know where to start because I want to ask you about your military career, and I want to talk about that. But I also want to talk about the excitement that you're doing with the novel. So if you don't mind, could you tell me why you won the Bronze Star with a V in Afghanistan?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a little bit of correction there. So I do have a Bronze Star, but the V is for a Valor, and that's for my Air Medal, not the Bronze Star. So just quick correction. But
okay. Gotcha. That is a big thing. So I didn't realize that. Okay.
No worries at
just
all.
Reading.
I think like most folks who are in combat and have had and have been awarded a medal or a ribbon or something, it's usually on a day that things didn't go right. And so for me, that day was June 28th, 2005. And so I was the air mission commander for a flight of 2 Apaches and 2 Blackhawks, and we were trying to go rescue 4 Navy SEALs who were pinned down by the Taliban. And so that whole engagement and story is much better told in Marcus Luttrell's book, Lone Survivor. But long story short, there were 2 MH-47s which are Chinooks that fly with the 160th, that were full of SEALs as well ahead of us, and the lead one was shot down, and I couldn't stop it. And so, like I said, went from a bad day to a really bad day, and afterwards, I was awarded an Air Medal with V device for it. So
you have Operation Red Wings. And was that Extortion 17? Was that the other one?
No. So unfortunately, there have been quite a few Chinooks that have been shot down in Afghanistan. And so it was Operation Red Wings. As part of the rescue attempt for Red Wings, there was a Chinook full of Navy SEALs that was flying ahead of me that was shot down. Extortion 17 happened a number of years later and was a Chinook as well, but was not part of the 160th. And then if you go all the way to the beginning of Afghanistan during the initial invasion, there is a operation known as Roberts Ridge, where there have been 2 Medals of Honor awarded. One is for a Navy SEAL, and the other one is for a guy named Chapman who tried to rescue a Navy SEAL, and there was a Chinook shot down as part of that rescue attempt as well. So the Chinooks are very capable aircraft, but also very big and very prone to getting hit by RPGs if they're hovering in the wrong place, unfortunately.
Yeah. Is that why I don't know. I know nothing about nothing, but is that when they decided to send in close air support with the Warthogs after that, or were they doing that all along?
They're actually doing that. So on my operation, there were 2 A-10s that were flying overhead at the time. The issue is that it's really, really hard. First off, the Taliban are pretty smart. They've been doing it for a long time, and it's really, really hard to see guys on the ground when they're blended in with the trees and when they're kind of hidden there. And so even though like the Apache, we had sensors too, but during the daytime, the infrared sensor wasn't always as effective, and it was, we couldn't see anything either. And so it was the 2 A-10s that were flying over the head at the time for my operation. Once the helicopter was shot down, one of the A-10s rolled in and started shooting white phosphorus rockets on either side of the crash site to try and keep the Taliban off any potential survivors. And so the A-10s have saved a lot of lives and certainly saved my bacon on that day too. But unfortunately, they weren't able to stop the shoot down.
And you got your Bronze Star for what aspect of that, besides just being a badass on a plane?
The the Air Medal with Valor, that the Bronze Star was just part of my overall deployment to Afghanistan. The Air Medal with V device for Valor was for that operation. And I think it was just basically for staying there. So what happened is that as we were coming in, so this, I have to back up a little bit and tell you that we were the first longbows into Afghanistan. And the reason why that's important is the longbow helicopter, the Delta model, is about 5,000 or 6,000 pounds, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on how it's loaded, heavier than the original Apache, what was called the Alpha model Apache. But when we went to Afghanistan, we had the same engines. And so what that meant is that when you're high, hot, and heavy, which is a summer day in Afghanistan, you're severely power limited. And in fact, we didn't often have enough power to even hover in the summertime. And so what you do when you were loaded is you'd kind of bounce along the ground and try and get through what's called effective transitional lift that happens about 18 or 22 knots before you hit the wall on the other side of the FARP, which is the place where you get the gas and bullets. And so a lot of times when you would fly in an Apache, they had little explosives on the wings that would let you blow off what's called the jettisonable stores, like the rocket pods or missiles if you were carrying them. And so oftentimes you've had your front seater, if you're a pilot in command, you flew in the back like I did, and then the co-pilot flew in the front usually. You would have he or she have their finger on the collective, had a little button that you could hit that would blow off the stores. And so if you thought you weren't going to have enough power to crash or to take off rather, or if you were coming in for a landing and you got into a point where you didn't have enough power, either to fly away or cushion the landing, you could blow off the stores and it would give you just a little bit more power that hopefully you'd be able to use to kind of cushion as you were crashing. And so the reason why that's important, and people get kind of mad if you do that. So you try not to either blow off the stores or crash the helicopter. They frown on both of those things. And so the reason why this is important is that when we launched to try and go get the SEALs, really the only thing we knew was a call sign for them, the radio frequency, and the last known grid coordinate. And that grid coordinate was very high up on a mountain. And so as you're flying in Afghanistan, what happens is the aircraft you're protecting, usually the Black Hawks fly in front and the Apaches fly in back, so that if the helicopter in front gets shot at, the gunships can kind of turn in and provide suppressing fire. But when you're maybe 5 or 6 kilometers away from the landing zone where those helicopters are either going to land or they're going to hover and let troops fast stroke out the side, you switch positions. And so the reason why you do that is so that the Apaches can go in first and clear the landing zone. And so what you're looking for are, guys on the ground, or if you get shot at, you're going to start engaging the folks on the ground and either clear that landing zone or tell the Black Hawks or Chinooks that it is a hot landing zone. Usually you'd call a hot landing zone cherry and a cold landing zone ice. And so as we were climbing higher and higher, I had to keep slowing down further and further just to maintain enough power to be able to climb up to the top of the mountain. And so I kept calling the Black Hawks in my flight and saying, hey, you got to slow down, you got to slow down. And they would slow down so that we could stay in formation. And when the 2 Chinooks that were in front of us, and I called them and said, hey, you've got to slow down or you're going to beat us to the landing zone. And the lead Chinook made the decision to go anyway. And he said, we're still going to go to the landing zone. You can clear it once we get here. And so what happened is that he came to a hover, and as the SEALs threw the fast ropes out and prepared to fast rope, he got hit by an RPG, and he kind of turned and just kind of rolled down the side of the hill and crashed, and it killed everybody on board. And so when that happened, I was in the middle of trying to pass the Black Hawks so that I could go ahead of them and clear the landing zone. And it kind of became like a starburst effect where everybody, the Black Hawks turned away from the landing zone, which turned into my wingman and I as we were flying. And it was grace of God we didn't have helicopters collide right there. And so I went down one valley, my wingman went down another valley, and and I couldn't even find him at first because the terrain was so restrictive. And so the A-10 that was overhead kind of vectored us back together, which took a while. And in your head, you're just thinking like, I can't believe this just happened. I can't believe a helicopter just got shot down. I can't believe I'm getting, shot at. And it took like a minute or two to kind of recage yourself and say, okay, this is what normal is now, and we have to get after it. And I remember my front seater at the time saying, we have to get back in there. And I'm like, he's absolutely right. This is what we do. And so I couldn't, because the A-10 had shot those rockets, to me, just everything looked on fire, and I couldn't figure out where the crash site was. For a while, we did this thing where the A-10 would shoot a laser on the ground, and we would try and slave our sensors to it and find it. And finally it got to the point where he was literally overhead and would say, turn right, stop, turn left. And when we flew over the crash site, I still thought he had the wrong coordinates, because there wasn't anything that looked like a helicopter. It was just kind of waves of fire, and everything was burning. And so the only thing we could do, my wingman and I, is to just keep flying back and forth over the crash site to try and see if we could spot any survivors. And it was horrible in a whole bunch of different ways. But one of the worst was that we were very, very scared to shoot back for fear of accidentally killing any of the Americans that were alive. And so there was more than one time where you're coming to the top of the hill and a guy pops up and he shot an RPG at us. And the Apache has this amazing gun that hangs underneath of it, and it can slave to your eyes. So wherever you look, the eye or the gun looks. And so my front seater had the gun, and he saw the guy with the RPG, and he looked and went to squeeze the trigger. And what happens is, if the gun turns too far, there's a software limit to keep it from shooting, so you don't actually shoot yourself. And so he saw the guy squeeze the trigger, and then the gun didn't shoot. And then as we came back around, we were trying to figure out which, and you can imagine the top of the mountain, and there's, grass and boulders and rocks and trees. And you're like, did it come from that tree or that rock or that? And so the only thing we could keep doing was just flying back and forth and trying to draw fire and trying to see if we could find any survivors. And we couldn't, and we didn't find any. And we kept flying back and forth over top of that mountain until we ran out of fuel and had to come back. And so so you say, why did I get an Air Medal with Valor? I'm not sure, because I don't feel like I really did. I did my job, but I think if you would look in the write-up for it, it would say something about, because we stayed on the crash site under fire, trying to find survivors. So it's a terrible thing when you spend your entire life training to do something, and then in that moment in time, everything goes sideways, and you can't ever get that moment in time back again. And so, I was only, maybe 32 or something at the time. And I remember afterwards thinking, am I ever in my life going to have anything that significant again? Am I ever in my life going to get the opportunity to do it right instead of having it all go wrong? And it was a hard thing. I spent a lot of time reckoning with, and frankly, I think that's when I wrote 3 books that didn't sell before I wrote Without Sanction. That was the first book that did sell in a 2-book deal that led to the Clancy stuff that ultimately led to the Flynn stuff. And I think one of the reasons why Without Sanction did sell was because I was finally brave enough to put in it the kind of things that I was wrestling with. And so at the time had a lot of survivor's guilt and had a lot of the questions that we just talked about. And so my protagonist, Matt Drake, is a DIA case officer, which is a fancy way of saying he's a spy. And in the first book, he's wrestling with something that happened in Syria, that he lost an asset, and his asset's family and his best friend was horribly disfigured in a roadside bomb, and he feels responsible for it. And I think in fiction, even though what you're trying to do is tell a really great story, readers can resonate with veracity. Like, you see things on the page that you believe. And I think you really only see that when the author is willing to put little pieces of him or herself in the pages. Yeah, it's true. I mean, when you tell the truth about yourself, people understand, people get it. Like, my screw up on the extortion 17 thing, I was just like, you were at the beginning. I was thinking you went in to help afterwards, but that Chinook you saw
blow up was that Chinook. And that's why I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's amazing. How do you, I guess for lack of a better word, absolve yourself of that survivor's guilt? Do you write through it? I know you kept looking for, the adrenaline rush in your life and that sort of thing, but now that you've come through that, and I do want to talk about that, how do you write your way through it, or is that what you do?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think certainly writing is very cathartic, but I think in some of that in my fourth Matt Drake Forgotten War was very much cathartic over my feelings of watching Afghanistan crumble as we withdrew for it, and watching that, right? They're kind of bookended, where the worst until the Extortion 17 tragedy that day, June 28, 2005, was the most SEALs in the history of the SEALs were killed on that day. And so you have that on one side, and you don't want that, and you don't want it to be true, but you think in your head, well, by God, it happened. Hopefully, at least it meant something. And then you see the crumble from Afghanistan crumble, and what we spent 20 years of blood and treasure and tears building just collapse. And then you think, well, did it mean anything? And so that was part of what I tried to figure out as I was writing Forgotten War. But to answer your first question, when I tell veterans now, so I got out of the Army a long time ago now. I got out in 2007. I spent 10 years in. And I tell veterans now that there's a couple of things you don't realize when you're in the military. And so the first one being how much of your sense of purpose and who you are is tied up in what you do, and that you wouldn't probably be able to put it in the words, but you have this sense that what you do is noble, that it's bigger than you, that it matters, that you're doing something important with your life. And when you leave that and go to a civilian job, I have a really good friend who works for Procter & Gamble, and for a while he sold diapers. And I have 3 kids. I'm a big fan of having diapers, but to go from chasing bad guys in Afghanistan to selling diapers can be a really hard transition to make. And the second part of that being, if you had a bad day, and most everybody who went to combat does have a bad day, when you get out of the military, you've separated yourself from the only community of people who actually understand what you've gone through. And so as you're trying to reckon with your sense of purpose and who you are in this bad day, there's nobody there that can walk alongside you and say, hey, I've been through this. I know what you're feeling. I know what you're thinking. And so to answer your question, I was fortunate enough that after 3 years, I got out of the Army and spent 3 years in corporate America, and then went to the FBI, and then from there went and joined a small company that was staffed almost completely with veterans and completely with folks from the special operations community. And so the guy who owned that company is a man named Nate Self. He's a little bit younger than me, and he was, going back to Roberts Ridge that we started talking about in the beginning, he was the leader of that Ranger Quick Reactionary Force whose helicopter was shot down, and he lost several men on the shoot down. And then after he took control of the mountainside, because there had already been 2 helicopters shot down on that day, they would not send another helicopter until nightfall. And he had several critically injured men who died that could have been saved if they would have sent a helicopter. And the only thing he could do was watch them die. And so I heard his story and he heard my story. And at some point he looked at me and he said, it wasn't your fault. And so that wasn't anything my wife hadn't told me 1,000 times or anybody else. But it's kind of like if you today got a diagnosis that you had stage 4 cancer, the person you'd really want to talk to is somebody who made it on the other side of that, who beat stage 4 cancer. And their words, though they might be the same as what anybody else would tell you, would carry more weight because they'd been there and they'd made it out to the other side. And so that's kind of my story. I had to find that community of people who also had bad days, who could kind of provide that absolution, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I try and do that now.
one of the things that you said in your latest Matt Drake book is that the Forgotten War, and you talked a little bit about. I mean, you could tell that you had expertise. One of the things that you said was, "Well, is the minigun going to fire? Is the minigun ready to fire?" And your pilot in this particular novel, a woman, says, "Well, is the jet, is the whatever going?" Of course, I obviously not expert here. So anyway, and it was just like, I'd never really thought about that. And how could you not? You couldn't shoot a gun unless that particular part was going. And for whatever reason, I've decided I'm going to forget it because I'm whatever. But yeah, having a great day. This is for me a bad day, so I know I'm in good shape. But I just thought, that's really interesting. How you got to power up the gun in order to use it. It never occurred to me. Heard you in a podcast. And it was, I think it was definitely Jack Carr podcast, who I have great admiration for, and he's talking about you were talking about having an extra battery for that. Yeah. Just that. I mean, like who thinks of those things? Well, not me, not me. It goes. It's got an operating motor and it shoots, and that's all I know. But I just want to let you know I appreciated that. Your expertise comes out in your novel, and you, especially in this particular one about Afghanistan, you talk about it. It's the really great storyline. I like the way you combine the SEALs and the juxtaposing your Army character with, all this stuff. And I like the camaraderie, and I also like the, making fun of each other. That always makes me laugh. But one of your friends and your protagonist's friends has a pretty hard time, and then you're both commiserating. Your characters are both commiserating in the bar at the end, the special room, and talking. And basically, the question is, was it worth it? Well, was it worth it?
Still, I wish I could just say yes. I know. I think if I try and look at the positive side of the equation, certainly the 20 years we were in Afghanistan, the lives of the Afghan people were better for it. I think we crushed Al-Qaeda and kept them from attacking America again. If you stack that up on one side and stack up, the men and women who lost their lives there and the way it turned out, was it still worth it? I'm still not sure. And to be honest, part of me being conflicted about it is that when I saw it crumbling, I kept getting all these calls and texts and emails from my friends who were veterans who had served there, and they were all asking me that question, and I didn't know what the answer was. And the incredible thing about the war on terror in Afghanistan is less than 0.25% of the U.S. population served in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that 0.25%, I'm the anomaly. I only served one tour of duty. Most of those men and women served multiple tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. And for 20 years, they willingly bore our nation's burdens. There was no draft. There was no compulsory service. Men and women raised their hands knowing they were going to go into combat, and many of them re-enlisted again after being in combat, or re-enlisted many times. And so as a dad, my oldest was born shortly after September 11th, and he is actually getting ready to graduate from college, and he'll be commissioned as a Marine Corps officer. He made poor career choices, so he has to be a Marine. And so, as a father, you can look at Afghanistan and say, surely my son shouldn't have to go back there a generation later. Like, surely there should be something that says we have made enough progress in 20 years that doesn't have to be a generational war. And so I think I don't want to speak for all veterans, but I think many veterans you would talk to would be fine with us being done with Afghanistan. But I think we feel like we were owed a better ending than that can't be how we left. And so I think those two things, like I said, are a little bit at odds with each other, but I think folks are pretty universal on that the way it happened was such, and And it's kind of like Afghanistan, or our perceived success there was the foundation upon which many things were built. The war in Iraq, the thought that the sacrifices were worth it, that the folks that didn't come home, or even the ones that did, that spent years of their lives. Like my best friend, he and I were troop commanders together in Afghanistan, and he stayed in, just retired as a full bird colonel probably 3 or 4 years ago. He spent at least 6 years of his life away from his family over those 20 years. And that should mean something, that there should be a better return on the investment, on the sacrifices his family made, than what we have now. And that's still something I struggle to come to terms with.
I was talking to a friend one time, he's a trainer, and we were talking about, he's also a coach and stuff. And one day I just, we're in the gym, and he goes, well, I'm just not quite sure how to get at the kids and explain to them, how to achieve every single day. And I go, well, achievement's a different scale every day. And achievement is, like, today it might be that he runs a 440 just a little bit faster, and that's going to be a victory for that day, okay? Or he's going to lift a little bit more, or he's going to show a little bit more flexibility, or footwork increases, or whatever, in efficacy or something. And he looked at me, and it was like, hey, dumb lady in the gym just gave me the answer that I've been looking for, because everybody's got to have a victory every day. Everybody in Afghanistan, if they made things a little bit better, have a victory in Afghanistan, okay? They do. And you're right, they deserved a better end. And that is forever to the United States shame, dishonored every single person, as far as I'm concerned, who ever served one day in that hellhole on behalf of the United States. And I would say also, just me, and I'm sure you might agree, I don't know, but they should have sent the CIA special ops in there. They went to Tora Bora. They should have just found Osama bin Laden. They should have found Zawahiri, and they should have killed those bastards and get the hell out of there, because look what happened. Mission creep set in. We're going to have civilizational change. And guess whose civilization changed? Ours. And it always seems to happen. It always seems to happen. And it's such a dishonor.
It is, but I think the other part I think about is that when American body bags stop coming home every single day, which is great, what it does, because such a small percentage of the population served, that it takes the fact that men and women are even deployed off the minds of everyday Americans. And so I think without a populace to hold them accountable or to keep their feet to the fire, it became too easy for our leaders, and both in the military and on the civilian side. On politicians are in charge with coming up with national strategy, and the military generals are in charge of executing it. And I think it let both of them off the hook, where it became too easy just to have the status quo and continue to send more people there and continue to send more people there. And presidents come and go, and generals come and go, and you turn around and look and say, we've been here 20 years, and yeah. Why, and what did we accomplish in that 20 years?
Does it give you? Oh, go ahead. I want to hear from you.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you about the military-industrial complex and how that just feeds the beast. But I would rather hear from you.
Yeah,
You're the interesting one here.
I think there are, I'm kind of of two minds on that too. And so full disclosure, I've spent most of my career out of the military working for defense contractors, and the ones that I've worked for absolutely produced tools that men and women going into harm's way needed and kept them safer. And so from my vantage point, which is obviously limited by my life experience, I've never had the sense that certainly the little companies that I worked were somehow able to continue the war in Afghanistan going so that they could make a couple bucks selling stuff to the military. And in my thing, it's been the opposite of that, where we watch, the last company I worked for is an incredible one named Apache that we were the American subsidiary of an Israeli startup. And in fact, I have my old boss, I got to talk to 2 days ago on his first day off from the IDF after Saturday, and what that's been like for him and what he's been doing. But the founder of that company, and what we did was made uniforms and hide sights that made people invisible. that masked their thermal and visual signatures. And the reason why we did that is because our founder was an Israeli special operations guy during the Second Lebanon War, and he was leading his team of men into Lebanon at night and thought he was invisible. And the Russians, or the Iranians, had provided Hezbollah with Russian-made thermal sights, and he was shot and a couple of his friends were killed. And so he came back from that and said, by God, there has to be a better way, and came up with a system that are now saving American lives in combat. And so I certainly understand the argument behind the military-industrial complex, but from what I've seen is the opposite of that, of we are in harm's way, and what can we do to give our sons and daughters every advantage they can, every technological overmatch, because we don't want there to be a fair fight, right? We want it to be completely one-sided. And so that's been my perspective on it, or I guess my life experience on it.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. That gives me, that's a little happy thought for today. I just wonder, what does your friend who's in the IDF say? What do you say? Any inside dope?
Trying to censor a little bit on what he said. I think the high level of what you can say was that last Saturday for 8 hours were the worst 8 hours of his life, that there were times that they were more surprised than they were during Yom Kippur. And I think there were times where they didn't know how big the invasion is and when they were going to be able to stop it. I think the thing that struck me is he was relaying as he was getting off the phone, and he was literally calling me to keep him awake so that he could make it home because he'd been on duty for so long. And the difference between those two organizations is the last thing he told me was how an operation had gone down and how he had purposely delayed a strike because there were kids nearby, and he was willing to give up the target so that the kids could get out of the way. And you contrast that with these barbarians who came into a peace-loving nation solely to target little kids and women and grandmothers. And if you can't understand the difference between those two mindsets and why one of those is noble and one of them is barbaric, I don't know what to do for you. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you must be looking with great interest at the college campuses and some congressional members standing up there and saying, go, whatever. But now you're out of it, except you're writing about it. And how did the Vince Flynn situation come? You kind of glided over it a little bit. Well, and then I wrote a couple of novels, and then Tom Clancy's organization came calling. It doesn't just happen like that. Come on, man. Tell me a little bit about that, and then how Vince Flynn occurred, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I think writing is like any other business in the standpoint that it's your success is probably equal parts showing up every day and working as hard as you can, and then being in the right place when there's a little bit of luck, and the only reason why you get to take advantage of that luck is because you worked hard enough to be there when that lightning strikes, I guess, if you will. And so for me, was it, and kind of going, you touched a little bit on why I write or who I write about. When my first book, when Without Sanction came out, I had an interviewer say, "Are you Matt Drake?" And I said, I'm absolutely not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the room with men who could be. And that has been my way to still feel connected to those people that I care about, that when I was a defense contractor, we would go into a team room and listen to them talk and listen to what they're trying to understand, exactly how they were doing their mission so that we could tailor the solution as accurate as possible. But at the same time, you get to know these great Americans in a way that most people don't. And I'm like, you know what? I get to know these stories. I should tell some of these stories. And that's why in my books, there are a lot of Easter eggs where there are people who are real characters that are in my books. Now, because I'm a writer, I like to piss them off a little bit. And in my Clancy books, there's a Green Beret named Jad, and Jad is a real person. But in real life, Jad is a Navy SEAL, and so I made him a Green Beret, which I think is funny, and he doesn't think is quite as funny. But, Having said that, the when I wrote my first two books, I was really fortunate that the editor for my books was also the editor for the Tom Clancy series. And so there's kind of a truism in writing that a lot of people can write one book, but very few people can write two books. And the reason is you have your entire life to write that one book. You might have this one burning idea and you write it. And then when you sit down to write your second book, number one, you have to write it in a time frame, which is usually a year or less. Number two, you know what people thought of your first book, and you're trying to figure out a way to wall off some of that and the people that hated it and think you should have never written in the first place. And then the third part is that, maybe all the ideas you had, you poured into that first book, never thinking it was actually going to get published. And you're like, now what do I do? And so for me, when I turned in my second book, it was kind of proof to my editor that I could write more than one book, just as the guy, Mike Madden, who had been writing the Clancy books before me, decided he didn't want to write them anymore. And so it was very, part of it, like I said, was showing up and working hard. And then the other part being fortunate to be in the right space at the right time, where my editor asked me if I wanted to write them. And so what that came with, like most great opportunities, is a whole lot more work. And so in order to make that happen, I had to write a book every 5 months for about the last 2.5 years, because this year in 2023, I had 3 books come out. So Forgotten War was my 4th Matt Drake book, and then Flashpoint was my 3rd Clancy book, and then Weapons Grade was my 4th Clancy book. So the way that happened is I started working on 2 of those almost 1.5 years or 2 years ago. And so my first book, Without Sanction, came out in 2020, and my 8th book, Weapons Grade, just came out in September. So in 3 years, I've had 8 books come out, which is pretty crazy. And I have a fantastic editor. But to answer your question, I think the Flynn gig was possible because of the Clancy one. And so I had Mark Graney is a friend of mine and is a wonderful writer and has written for Tom Clancy when Tom was still alive, and then was the first one to write after Tom passed away. And then he has his Gray Man series, which is fantastic. And he told me when I was trying to figure out if I should take the Clancy deal, because I still had a full-time job, and frankly, it didn't pay enough yet for me to be able to do that. And so I knew I'd have to take a gamble on myself and hope I'd be able to work and get better advances with subsequent books. And Mark said, if you're offered the opportunity to write one of these legacy series like Clancy or Flynn or W.E.B. Griffin or the Bourne books, he said that's kind of like the industry putting their stamp of approval on you and saying, this guy can write. And so he said, I'm not promising you riches, but I am telling you that if you take this gig, you will not lack for work. Whether if you can parlay that into can do it full time. He said, I can't promise you that. Very few people can, but you have passed the test if you write this Clancy book and they like it. And so after writing 3 or 4 Clancy books, I had gotten to the point where I kind of had more ideas than I had time to write. And I knew I would still need to write a legacy series. And Vince Flynn has always been my favorite author. When my second book, Clancy was the one that got me into this thing. But Vince Flynn was the first one who, even before Brad Thor, who post 9/11 had this hero who unabashedly tracked terrorists down and shot him in the face. And I think after 9/11, that is what we all wanted. And Vince's character, Mitch Rapp, embodied that. And I think every one of us who write in this genre takes something from Vince Flynn. And probably a lot of our protagonists take something from Mitch Rapp. And so when my second book didn't sell, I actually took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which is Protect and Defend, and I took note cards and note carded out the entire book, every chapter, every character, a different color.
Yes. How did he put that together?
Yes. It's a difference. It's kind of like the difference between looking at a house and looking at the blueprints of the house. And so you can now start to see, like, what was the genius of what he did? How did he do it? And so as I was, fast forward to about a year ago, and I was looking at, okay, I'm a full-time writer. What do I want to work on? And I was praying about it and talking to my wife. And I really was thinking, you know what? If I'm going to write a legacy series, why not see if I can write, my favorite series in the entire world. And I thought, it's such a dumb idea. And I talked to my wife, who is the savior of many ideas that I think are dumb. And she's like, why not ask? And so I said, I'm not going to ask. I knew Emily Bestler, the editor, a little bit, because like you, I was super apprehensive when Kyle took over. And I thought, can anybody do what Vince did? And so he did. And when there were moments, I call them Mitch moments in each book where I feel like Kyle 100% captured exactly what Vince would have done if he would have written that section. And so every now and then I would just email Emily Bestler as a fan and say, I loved this section of Kyle's book. I thought he knocked it out of the park. And so I knew her a tiny bit, but certainly not enough to have this conversation. And so I said to my wife, I said, okay, I will talk to my agent about it. And I have a fantastic agent, Scott Miller. And so I said, Scott, I've got this crazy idea. And he said, you know what? It's an agent's job to ask. Let me ask her. And so he did.
Right
and
answer.
Yeah, exactly. That's why he's a great agent, right? And so it was, again, I got to be in the game because of the work I'd done so far. And then the luck part being Kyle had decided he didn't want to write them anymore. And they were interviewing a couple of different writers to take his place. And so I got to talk to Emily for a while. Vince's agent is a guy named Sloan Harris. And the reason why this is important is that writing for Clancy was incredible, but I was one of many writers who had done that. And there are all kinds of Tom Clancy books, and it's much more like a big corporation. You got Tom Clancy movies, Tom Clancy video games, Tom Clancy books. With Vince Flynn, there's just the books, and they did do the one movie on American Assassin. And so when I talked to Sloan, his agent, and Sloan is super to this day protective about Vince, will tear up at times as he's talking about Vince and how much he loved him and how much he meant to him. But it felt much more like, hey, there's this mom and pop small business, and we're thinking about letting you come on board. So let's talk about what that would look like. And it was several conversations. They had looked at my Clancy books and then read some of my Matt Drake books, and then came back and said, okay, we want you to come and do this. And so again, like it was very fortunate that the luck part that I got to ask the question that I did, but also the fact that I was there was kind of the hard work that we talked about before.
Sure.
So
yeah, absolutely. What was that one thing, or what was one thing that you think that Vince Flynn, keep conflating the names, Vince Flynn did in his books that made him just that much different from any of these other in the genre?
So I think what Vince did really, really well is that Mitch Rapp will do things that make all of us squeamish, but he never devolves when he does that. And what I mean by that is Mitch has this moral compass that always points true north, that will not, he doesn't, like if you look at crime fiction a lot, like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos or something, what those really are is a study of human depravity. Like how much can a person devolve and what kind of terrible things do they do? And Mitch does terrible things, but he does them to people who need terrible things done to them. And he never loses himself in it. He never becomes a monster because he has that sense of right and wrong, that there is an absolute right and there's an absolute wrong, and that men can successfully navigate those two. I mean, I go back again to my friend on the IDF who, after what Israel's a small country, it's you know, I can't remember if it's 6 million or 9 million, but everybody there knows each other. Everybody is family, everybody. And so while my friend hadn't had anybody in his immediate family who was killed, 2 of his coworkers lost their sons in the attack. And so if you think if there's anybody who should say, I could care less about these kids, we're going to prosecute the target, and he still exercises that moral restraint because he's a good man. And he's doing a bad thing to people who need bad things done to them, but he's still not losing his humanity and his sense of right and wrong as he's doing them. And I think Vince captured that maybe better than any other writer.
Doesn't devolve into nihilism.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. I always liked the way he wrote the dialogue. I thought he did real well. I've read Clancy just left me cold. This is just like with dialogue, but I always enjoyed all the technical stuff, and all the acronyms and all that stuff. But I always like, so he needs help with that. But yeah, so, well, I wanted to find out a little bit about, didn't you have to try out for the Vince Flynn gig? You had to write some stuff, or?
So not so much as like they said, hey, write a sample and we'll look at it. It was more, like I said, I'd written 7 books by then, and so they knew what my writing was like. And I had kind of a pretty frank conversation with them where I said, hey, the way my writers fall into one or two camps. So Kyle Mills is pretty famous for doing these extensive outlines. He'll write 42 or 50,000 words before he even writes the book of here's everything that's going to happen. I said, my brain just doesn't work that way. And I said, to the point where my last Clancy book, Weapons Grade, that just came out, when I sat down to write it, I only had 5 months to write it. And the Clancy book before that, Flashpoint, was a big book. Like, it had stuff that took place in the South China Sea and in Germany. And then I had Jack Ryan Sr. in the White House. And so when my editor and I kind of had the talk, I said, I think I'm going to write a small book this time, in the sense that my son goes to Texas A&M. I live north of Austin, and I drive back and forth, and you hit these little tiny Texas towns. And every Texas town has 3 things. It has a Pizza Hut, a Dairy Queen, and a brand new credit union. I'm like, what does this little town have this brand new credit union? There must be something shady going on. And so I told him I'm going to write this book about just this, like Jack being in this small Texas town and bad stuff happening. And he's like, oh, kind of like a Lee Child, Jack Reacher. I'm like, exactly. And so I sit down to write this book, and 4 months into it, he comes back and says, hey, so here's some ideas for the cover, and here's some ideas for the title based on this Jack Reacher book you're writing. And I said, well, about that. So now the book is about the Iranians getting nuclear breakout and this crazy thing happened in Israel. And so to his credit, he wrote back and he said, does the Iranian weapons facility get blown up? Because I can put that on the cover. And I'm like, yeah, I think it does. And so the point being that the way I write is more organic, where I'm telling myself the story as I write it. And so when I talked with Emily, and Emily's a fantastic editor. She has lots of writers who write both ways. And so it certainly wasn't a surprise to her. But when I talked to Sloan, part of what I said is like, look, I'm happy to write you a synopsis if that's what you want, but I can almost with 100% certainty tell you that is not what the book is going to be about when I'm done with it. And so to his credit, he read my other books and stuff, and they said, you're the guy we want. And so we're going to trust you that the book that you come out with is going to be the book that we're going to want. And that's what I said to him. I was like, look, this is another benefit of having worked in the industry as you start to establish a reputation. I said, you can talk to my old editor, and he will tell you the links that we went together to make sure that Clancy was happy with every book. And I said, I can't tell you what the book is about, but I can guarantee you that I won't stop until you're happy with the book. And that's what the final product was. And so that was kind of the tryout. It was more, like I said, just the interviews and then reading my prior books.
Creative control, then. You have creative control?
Yeah, they're pretty amazing. I talk with, when I sat down to write the book, and I'm almost at 80,000 words, I think, with it now. When I sat down to talk with Emily and then with Sloan separately, I said, in broad strokes, here's what I think I'm going to do or where it's going to be. And to their credit, they're both like, okay, sounds great, go do it. And so you get, I think the best, I have a friend who's a fantastic writer. His name's John Deacon. He writes Westerns, and he was a Golden Glove boxer, got a boxing scholarship to Penn State. And he told me once that the purpose of a referee in a boxing match is to worry about your opponent so you don't have to. Your job as a boxer is just to fight as hard as you can, and it's the referee's job to keep your opponent safe. And I think a really great editor is the same way for a writer, in that what you do as a writer is sit down and do the craziest thing, push the envelope the absolute farthest you can, and know that that editor is going to be kind of your guardrails and help you bring that book back into, if you drift off course, help you bring it back on course so that it is that incredible thing that you and he or you and she sit down to work on together. And so I know I haven't had the pleasure of working with Emily until now, but as you said, like Brad Thor and Jack Carr and Connor Sullivan and all of these amazing folks have worked with her, and she's incredible. And she is the guardrails from the standpoint of she was Vince's very first editor and has been the editor for all of Kyle books and everything. And so it gives me a little bit, I'll be honest, I'm very nervous about this book because of how much it means to the fans, to be quite honest with you. When I went to the book launch with Kyle, there were probably 100 people in this little tiny bookstore in Minneapolis because it was Vince's hometown. And I recognized some of them from social media, and I knew they didn't live in Minneapolis. And so to start the interview, I said, raise your hand if you've traveled more than an hour to get here tonight. And probably 20, 25 hands went up, and I kept going until 5 hours. And there were people who had flown in from Atlanta, who had driven from Nebraska, who had come from Chicago, because this series and this character means so much to them. And so they've all been, when I took over the Clancy series, nobody really cared from the standpoint of they had done a good enough job that everybody believed that another writer could come in and do it. When I took over for Kyle, the fans were very supportive, but it was always some form of welcome to the club, but do not screw this up because this is our favorite character ever.
Absolutely,
which is fair.
Absolutely. You know, I was the last book Kyle wrote for the Vince Flynn novel, whatever. I just got it. What is it?
Code Red.
What is it?
Code Red.
Code Red. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So what I was thinking was, yeah, okay, interesting. You know, Mitch gets involved with the Russians, and they're talking about certain kinds of drugs that are on the street now, and all that stuff. And that's really interesting. Gives you entree into another sort of place where one can take the investigatory powers and the shoot them up and get after the bad guys with the character. So I wanted to know, would you have preferred to get the Vince Flynn series after the second of the last in the series that Kyle Mills did, or this very last one?
Yeah.
Because there was a huge plot twist and a lot of people were freaked out about it, like me.
I think calling that a plot twist might be small ball. Like, I had a heart attack at the end of that book. And I remember reading it. I looked at my wife and I'm like, I don't know what he's going to do next, because he didn't just upset the apple cart. Like, he threw everything on the ground and stomped on it. And so I was actually really nervous when I got done with that. But I think it was incredible what Kyle did, because it made so Mike Nash dying made everybody in the series up for grabs and potentially changed the entire course of it. Now, what Kyle did for his last book, Code Red, is kind of reset the table, and he told me he did that with me in mind, because he said, I didn't want you to try and have to pick up the pieces after I had a temper tantrum and left the room and destroyed everything. And so yeah. I'm much more glad that I get to pick up after that. But what he did do is, he and I were on tour together, and this woman stood up and said, hey, I loved Mike Nash. He was my favorite character. Is he really dead? Because I want to believe he's still alive. And Kyle looked at me and he's like, ask Don. I'm like, well, what am I going to do with that? And so I'm glad that I'm glad two things. I'm glad I get to pick up where I do, but I'm also incredibly glad that I get to work with people like Emily Bessler and Sloan Harris, who told Kyle he didn't even clear that with him. Like, he didn't even tell them what he did until he sent the book in, and they have enough respect for him as the writer in the series. I know. I was like, were you waiting for the text from Emily that's like, what did you do? And he's like, yeah, I was kind of curious what she was going to say. And I think that's a really hard line to walk as a writer, because when you have this legacy series, you want to give the readers what they love, but you still have to keep the series fresh, or else it starts to feel episodic. And so Kyle was very, very good at that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Are you going to kill off any characters? I mean,
all of them, every single one. We're going to reset the board. I'm about a little less than 80,000 words in right now. And I can't talk about what I'm doing, both because I'm not allowed to talk about it till Emily sees it. But the second part is the way I write is organic, and I'm not sure what's going to happen until I'm done. And a lot of times I'll change things in the second or third draft, or rather than going back and fix stuff, I'll have this character the whole way through. And in chapter 50, I'll put a note to myself. I'm like, this isn't really working. Just take him out completely. And so there would be, Kyle tells a really funny story about when he agreed to take the gig and everything was done. He said, well, send me what Vince has, because he knew Vince had been working on the book. And they said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I know you sent me 3 pages. Like, go into his office. There's going to be a couple notebooks and a box full of stuff. Just send me all that. And they said, there isn't that. And Kyle's like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, Vince just liked to pound it out. And so he went the first 3 pages. That was it. And so I feel like if people got my stuff, if I passed away and they had to start writing it, they'd be like, what was this guy thinking? This is more like a beautiful mind with things just going all over the place than it is a novel. So I don't know which one is worse.
How do you keep track of that in your head? It's all in your head. You don't plot it out, right?
I don't plot it out, but I'm reaching to get my high-tech legal notepad right here that has just, and so what I do is have lots of notepads and pens, and a lot of times I'll start every day just as almost like a journal entry, and I'll write just bullet points of things I'm thinking, things I think that might happen, things that don't. And it's really easy. From my FBI days, I got used to using legal pads because it's all the pages stay together and you can flip back and see what you've done before. And so that's kind of how I sort through it, is I'll go through and look at what I've done before, see what's kind of still hanging out there. There's a really good book called Save the Cat that was written by a guy who wrote spec screenplays for a living. And so he takes kind of the 3-act structure and nerds it out and says, these are the beats and everything. And I use that for the second draft, or sometimes as I'm working on it, but really I'm as much surprised as what happens as hopefully the reader is. And that's funny because it's part of the writing process that you have to get comfortable with. Another friend of mine, Nick Petrie, who writes the Drifter series with Peter Ash, told me about this. And he's like, you have to be comfortable that future Don's going to figure that problem out. Like, present Don has to think future Don will figure that out. And I'm like, okay, but I sure wish like future Don would tell present Don what happens, because I can't sleep right now because I can't figure out what's going to happen next. And that's, all kidding aside, I think that's one of the things you have to wrestle with as a writer, is what is your process, and then how do you stay comfortable in that process? Because it's what you need to write, and it's different for every writer. And if you, like, I've tried outlining, I've tried doing it how Kyle does, and my brain just locks up and I can't do it. And so I once told my wife that having a baby was kind of like running a marathon, and she didn't particularly like that comparison. But I do think that writing a book is kind of like running a marathon, in that when you do the first marathon at mile 20, the wheels come off and you're like, oh my gosh, why did I want to do this? And your second marathon, mile 20, doesn't get any easier, but it's coming, and eventually you'll get to the other side of it and you can finish. And I think that's much more like what my writing process is like. So in addition to Vince Flynn, I also get to write the Clancy books. And it's even harder because you have the books that came before you that you have to stay in that universe. And the Clancy is unique in that there are 2 writers who are writing in it at the same time. And so for me, it was Mark Cameron, and his book would always come out 6 months before mine. And so when I was working on my very first Clancy book, it was called Target Acquired. I was 3/4 of the way through this book, and I had this great idea for a romantic subplot. And I get this text from Mark, and he said, oh, by the way, I just turned in my book, and I gave your character a girlfriend, and she only has 1 arm. So good luck with that. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me right now. And so I get his book and read through it. Sure enough, she's got 1 arm, and he brings her home to mom and dad. And so when I got to the end of my book, I texted him and I said, oh, by the way, your character, Jack Ryan Sr., had a stroke and he is in a coma right now. Good luck. And so I texted him back pretty quick after that, because Mark Cameron used to be a U.S. Marshal and was a man tracker and is a Barham man. And frankly, I'm terrified of him. And so, but there were some come to Jesus moments between the 2 of us where we were, because I got the last laugh, because my last 2 books And this year, only one of his came out and two of my Clancy books. And so both of my Clancy books came out before his next one, so I could really stick it to him. And so in Flashpoint, I didn't get to go as far as Kyle did with Mike Nash, but I had this horrible thing happen to the campus, and all these people were hurt, and I didn't know how it was going to end yet because the way I'm writing. Well, he's trying to write his book at the same time, and he doesn't know which characters. And so I get this text from him, and he's like, can you at least just tell me who's still ambulatory? Can you tell me that? I'm like, all right. These are the people that can walk. I don't know about these other people. So I'm sure he is very happy to never have to write a book in the same universe with me again.
Oh, so you're not doing any more Clancy. You're just doing Vince
I'm not
Flynn
doing
right
any
now?
more Clancy, and he left too. So maybe we both got our fill of each other.
I could not do that. I don't know how you guys did that. Oh my gosh.
It was a little nuts. It was a little nuts.
Oh, well, you've got a lot of you've got a lot of responsibility on your shoulders with the Vince Flynn novels now, and I know you're more than up to the task.
Yeah, and it really was
Mitch
neat.
Flynn, Mitch Rapp lives.
Mitch Rapp lives, and I get to, I think I told you this, I can go through it or you can cut this out too, but he, so when we went to Minneapolis, I got to meet Lisa and her husband, her new husband. So Lisa is Vince's widow, and we got to have dinner together, and it was fascinating because I got to see Vince through his wife's eyes, and you know, I'd known him as a writer. I'd never gotten to meet him, or I'd known him as a fan. And then I got to hear kind of Sloane's version of him, and then Lisa's of her husband. And she said, you know, I knew you were the right guy when you told me the note card story, because for my favorite Vince Flynn book, I'd put up note cards and plotted it all out. And she said, when I first met Vince and we started dating, he was working on his second book, the one after Term Limits, which became his breakout bestseller. And she said, and I walked into his apartment. I didn't really understand what he did. And on his dining room table, he had note cards all over the table. And he told me, you know, I'm a writer. This is how I plot it out. And she's like, when you told me that story, it just reminded me of Vince. And I thought, this is the right guy to take his legacy. And so it was pretty amazing spending time with her, and pretty amazing hearing about her husband.
Did she say what a smart ass he was? Because he was.
She said that. She talked a lot about his dimples and how he could charm anybody. I didn't know Vince was dyslexic, and my wife teaches dyslexia. And so a lot of dyslexics are extremely creative, but obviously have a problem with writing. She said he absolutely hated the writing part, and that was the biggest struggle for him, was to actually put the words down on page. You know, he could think about how the plot was, he could visualize that stuff out, but the mechanics of writing was just agony for him because of his dyslexia. You just think about that, you know, one of the greatest writers of our generation, and had a hard time putting words down on paper. It's pretty incredible.
Wow. So the continuity for the franchise, is that something that you does somebody do that, or is that just sort of
does somebody do
course?
That? You are such a child of summer, Victoria. So when I started the Clancy books, I asked Mark Graney, I'm like, is there a Bible for the series? And his answer was cryptic, and I should have paid more attention to it. And he said, what I have, I will give you. And so he sends me this package, and it's I can't find the book, but it's Dead or Alive, this Clancy book that's about this thick. And on the outside of it, where the loose leaf pages, he has multicolored Post-it notes all the way through. And so when you flip to a note, it says, Jack Ryan has brown hair. And then you flip a little bit longer, and it talks about Jack Ryan's girlfriend. And so he had marked everything in this book that he would use as reference, but there was no documents. So in my house, we believe in capitalism, and I had a 14-year-old daughter, and I'm like, if you will take this and make it into a Bible, I'll pay you $20 an hour. And so she went through every detail and kind of turned it into a Bible. For the Rapp series, I don't know that Vince had anything, but Kyle is super organized. And so he sent me, I was like, can you email me what you have? And he said, I'll send you a link to a Google Drive instead. And so there were he has every book in its Word format, so he can search through it. He has another file with the synopsis for every book. He has another one with all the characters and stuff. And so he created the Bible and has done a really great job with it.
Wow. Yeah, and he's often doing his own series, or why did he want to leave?
Yeah, so he had, so Kyle wrote his own books, and then he wrote for the Jason Bourne universe, and then went to the Vince Flynn. And so when he was writing for the Jason Bourne universe, before he was writing for the Jason Bourne universe, he wrote this book called Fade, and it's about a guy who was a Navy SEAL, and he said, this whole time he's had that character kind of percolating in his head. And he said, a couple times he had ideas where he thought he could kind of make it into the Mitch Rapp universe, and it never worked. And he's like, this character has not left me alone for 20 years. I've got to go back and write the next book with him. And so he's doing that. And he also managed to end the Mitch Rapp series by getting #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for Code Red. So he set the bar just really low for me to just kind of hop over with my first book.
You were talking about the best writing little piece of information, little wisdom that you have, and I've heard you say in a podcast before that every time you go to a page, you want to answer a question because that makes it worthwhile. There's a reason for it being. Could you explain a little bit about that? Because I know you have writing seminars and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so this friend, Nick Petrie, and I told him when he gets done writing, he should be a psychologist or a shrink for writers, because we all call him up and it's like you put your head on Nick's lap and tell him things you're worried about, and he tells you, it'll be okay, it'll be fine. But one of the things that he told me once is that in a really great book, what's happening is a writer's trying to answer a question for themselves in the pages, that you're wrestling with something that you don't know the answer to. And so for Forgotten War, it was, it was very much, was it worth it? And for Without Sanction, my first book, it was kind of like, how do you find redemption? How do you, when everything goes wrong, how do you find redemption? How do you find purpose after that? And so I usually have some idea of what the question is going to be when I start. And then as I'm writing, that question gains more clarity, or I gain more clarity about the question. And so oftentimes what I'll have, there's another saying in writing, that writing is rewriting, and that so your first draft is bad, right? But you make it better with subsequent drafts. And so a lot of times, if that question isn't clear in the first draft, by the second or third or something, I'll have figured it out. But I think readers can sense that, because that again takes the book from just being something episodic. Like I'm a kid of the 80s when there was incredible television with shows like The A-Team. And so what was funny is watching my kids discover that on Netflix a couple years ago, and they watched it like crazy for about 2 days, and then they were done. And I asked my son, I'm like, why? And he said, Dad, the same thing happens every single episode. And I'm like, no. And I'm like, yeah, it kind of does. And so I think when you write books, one of the ways you have to give the readers what they came to that book for, but you also have to give them something different every time. And I think one of the ways that you can do that is through that question. What is that question that you, as an author, and by extension, your characters are wrestling with in that book that's unique to that book?
Are you the most curious person you've ever met?
I am a very, very curious person, and that plays in well to my books. And the reason is that you have to find something that's driving you as you're writing the book. And so, for instance, for my last book, Weapons Grade, again, being a kid of the 80s and an aviation geek, there was one airplane that was just the coolest one ever, and it was the SR-71 Blackbird. And so as I was writing Weapons Grade, it had this big hypersonic thing. I thought, man, it would be so cool if the Blackbird was still flying. And then I said, by God, I'm the writer. It can still be flying. And so I brought it back, but what was so much fun to bring it back is I found this retired 2-star Air Force general, was an Air Force test pilot. He flew the SR-71, and for 2 hours, I got to hang out on the phone with him as he told me flying stories, as I'm taking notes like crazy. And so at the end, I'm like, can I make you a character in the book? And he's like, yes, you can. And so I was very, very anxious to hear what he thought of it. And at the end, he emailed me and he said, it made me feel like I was back in the cockpit again. And so that kind of felt good to my heart. But the funniest thing about it is, this is a guy, I have a degree in engineering. He, I think, had a master's degree in engineering, was a test pilot, flew 65 different kinds of aircraft. And between the two of us, we could barely get Zoom to work. And so you can fly the SR-71 and still not be able to get Zoom to work. And so that was the tipping point in our interview. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, you can make everything fly. Don Bentley, you are going to just do a bang-up job, and I'm sure you already are, with the Vince Flynn series. And thank you so much for coming on the Adult in the Room podcast. I can't even talk. The podcast is appreciative of having you on, and great time. Thank you so much.
It has been so much fun. Thank you so much for having me, Victoria.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Adult in the Room podcast. To keep the programs you like to listen to, please rate this podcast with a fantastic 5 stars on your Apple Podcast app every time you listen. And give me a great review. Plus, of course, subscribe to the podcast. It makes a difference with the big tech algorithm and the big tech oligarchs, and it makes us easier to find. Please get in touch with me on all the big tech stuff. Yeah, we're still there. Using the names Victoria Taft or the Adult in the Room podcast on MeWe, Parler, Minds, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks to 1A Cast for imaging, editing, and production. The fantastic song is Gospel by the March 4th Band of Portland, Oregon. Music for Antifa versus Mike Strickland is Ride or Die by Raps by RC. The Adult in the Room podcast is also a production of Flamingo Road Studios. Remember, head up, heart out, and strive to be the adult in the room. Till next time, mischief managed.